Hi everyone. Welcome to, I guess, my new YouTube channel. I got this idea because I've had a lot of fans who've read my new book, An Unorthodox Match. I'll show you the picture. And in Hebrew, Samalacha Nafshi, which is my 11th book, who have been asking me to Skype with them. And there's a bit of a problem, because I live in Jerusalem. Some of you may not know that, and there's sort of a 7-8 hour time difference. So I said I would do a video and respond to questions that book clubs and fans have had about this book and try to reach you this way. So I'm inviting you into my office where I do this work and where I've written this, which is my 11th book. And I hope to answer some of your questions, and please feel free to write me and to visit my website, naomiragen.com. And for all of you to whom this is the first book of mine that you have read, with Shtisel coming out, people have just discovered the ultra-Orthodox world, and I think Shtisel is a great, Netflix show. But I have to say that in 1989, I actually set this ball rolling. So all of you who love Shtisel, please start reading my books. The first one was Jephthah's Daughter, published in 1989, and followed by Sotah and the Sacrifice of Tamar, and all of my other books until the very latest one, if this world of the ultra-Orthodox Jew interests you and you'd like to learn more about it. So here's the interview, and here are my answers. Good morning to all of my readers in Florida. Thank you so much for inviting me to answer your questions, which I'm delighted to do. I'm sitting here in beautiful Jerusalem. It's World Holocaust Memorial Day, and there are dozens of world leaders gathering from all over the world to just a few blocks from where I'm sitting here and talking to you. It's a very special day for Jews all over the world. I'm very happy to be able to answer your questions from such a wonderful spot, which is in the heart of the Jewish people. I'm going to say hello to Barbara Janoff and thank her so much for this opportunity. And I'm going to read your questions and then I'm going to answer them. Question number 1. What misconceptions about the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community do you think exists among Americans? Well, I think that the biggest misconception is that the ultra-Orthodox community is homogeneous, and that everybody in the ultra-Orthodox community lives a certain way, works a certain way, treats women a certain way, and nothing could be further from the truth. Ultra-Orthodoxy is an umbrella term, and it encompasses Jews from Ashkenazi backgrounds, Sephardic Jews, Hasidic Jews, Jews from very ultra-extreme sects like the Neturei Karta, which don't recognize the state of Israel. So I think that's probably the biggest misconception. I think also there's this idea that ultra-Orthodox Jews make women their slaves, and women are barefoot and pregnant and in the kitchen, and that more or less they don't really have a say about what goes on in their lives. This too is a tremendous misconception. Ultra-Orthodox men and women live very individual lives, and in fact, the whole idea of women being stuck at home, giving birth and not having lives of their own is the biggest misconception of all, because if it wasn't for ultra-Orthodox women going out to work and supporting their large families, there wouldn't be an ultra-Orthodox community. It is more or less, and I say this in some ways with pride in what women have accomplished, and in some ways I say it with a great deal of sadness, that truly the community exists on the backs of women and their backbreaking work. And I think there needs to be certainly more equality in that community, and who supports these very large and beautiful families. The next question is, do you think these misconceptions contributed to the attacks against them in Jersey City and Muncie, New York in December? And I would have to say a resounding and absolute no to that. I don't think that anti-Semitism or anti-Semites differentiate between Reform Jews, conservative Jews, Orthodox Jews, modern or otherwise, and ultra-Orthodox Jews. A Jew to an anti-Semite is the incarnation of evil. Every cliche in the book about the Jews running the world and the Jews being in control of the media and having all the money and all of these things. If anti-Semitism was based on any kind of knowledge about the Jewish community, perhaps there would be some differentiation, but there isn't, because anti-Semitism is based on total ignorance and on people who are really probably the dumbest people that ever lived, because they don't understand anything about the contributions of Jews to human civilization and to society and to morality. And you would only have philo-Semites if people who had interest in the Jewish community, even anti-Semitic interest, would do a little research and would understand. Anti-Semitism usually takes root among people who are dissatisfied with themselves, people who are really ignorant, people are filled with hatred, because maybe their father was an abusive alcoholic and they are looking for somebody to blame. So I would have to say that as much as Jews perhaps would like to think that they are safe if they are not a certain type of Jew, there is no such concept among anti-Semitism and anti-Semites. And as you can see, there have not been attacks only against the ultra-Orthodox, but among Jews from all sectors of Jewish life all over the Jewish world. The next question is, I found the role of women as portrayed in your book very interesting. They are breadwinners, housekeepers, facilitators for the men to study, and also do much of the parenting. Is this a realistic portrayal? And if so, how do you feel about it? Well, I'd have to say that I've lived among ultra-Orthodox Jews for close to half a century. In America, I lived in Borough Park for a year, and in Israel, I've lived in communities which were either ultra-Orthodox communities or bordered ultra-Orthodox communities for close to 40 years. So I would say the portrayal of the women in my books is based on this knowledge and based on what I see and what I hear and what I understand. Having many ties to people in the ultra-Orthodox community, I'm completely cognizant of what goes on there. And I would say that the women that I portray, for the good and for the bad, I have received much criticism on some of the things I say about the ultra-Orthodox community among ultra-Orthodox Jews. I don't think that's any secret that my books are considered extremely controversial. In fact, just the other day, someone wrote me and said the rabbis in Panama won't let any of the Jews read my books. So I thought that was funny. Since I had a lot of fans that I met in Florida that were actually made me a welcoming luncheon there years ago when my first book came out, and they were all from Panama. So I guess times have changed and the rabbis have changed. But I think it's interesting that you see this as a very positive portrayal, and I think most people who are not ultra-Orthodox Jews would see the portrayals of women and men in my books as completely fair and completely in tune with reality. And the criticisms that I put forth are criticisms that come from what is going on there, and my love for this community and my desire for them to reach the potential that they have for being one of the most
wonderful places and most wonderful communities to live in. Right now, that's not true. And there are too many things that are being swept under the carpet and too many things that need to be changed for me to give that kind of endorsement. But if you ask me the question that you asked me, if these portraits of women as career women and educators and supporters for their husband is accurate, I would have to say absolutely yes. The next question was, how does the Hasidic community in Borough Park, Brooklyn, differ from the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel? I would have to give you one word answer for that and expand, and I would say employment. I think that the ultra-Orthodox community in America expects people, Jewish men, to find jobs and go out to work. There are a number of abuses that go on in that community of the welfare system, which I sort of mention in my book. But I would say that these taking advantage of rental subsidies for poor families and food stamps, guaranteed incomes, all of these things, medical care. Not everybody in the ultra-Orthodox community lies on their application. Some of them really are very poor people, and of course there are widows and orphans among them as well. But there is widespread abuse of this, and I think that this is sort of looked down upon. And so you will find in America that many ultra-Orthodox Jews leave the yeshivot, leave the kollalim, and they go and they get jobs. And you will find even the most extreme ultra-Orthodox sects working in camera stores and their own small businesses and many other places like the Diamond District, in which they earn a living and support their families. And this is sort of inevitable, because when you're an ultra-Orthodox Jew and you have 10 children, you have daughters you have to marry off, and you want son-in-laws who are going to be Torah scholars. Now, the Torah scholar has to be supported at least for the first few years, and you've got to come up with money to help them buy an apartment. You have to come up with money for support for the years that your son-in-law will be learning. Otherwise, your daughter isn't getting married. So I think there's a real emphasis on that in the community in America. In Israel, I think that the system encourages people to stay in the kollel and yeshiva system and not to work and get benefits automatically and a stipend automatically. And this is something which has led to a great deal of animosity between secular and ultra-Orthodox Jews, in which it is felt that they're not sharing the burden, the tax burden, the army burden, and it's a matter of great conflict in the culture and the society of Israel. So it's something we really need to work on. But I'd like to say something else about the difference between these two communities, and that is, unlike the Jews of Israel, I think the ultra-Orthodox Jews of America are always looking over their shoulders, and I think the divide between Gentile and Jew affects them in a way, of course, which it doesn't affect or doesn't have any meaning at all in Israel. In Israel, there may be a ultra-Orthodox secular divide, but it's not based on hatred. I mean, these are our brothers, these are our sisters, and it's a family quarrel. I don't think it's a family quarrel in America. And I think the antagonism towards anybody who is visibly Jewish, which the ultra-Orthodox are, so it's, you know, they're sort of walking around with a mark on them, which allows anti-Semites to recognize them and to persecute them much more easily. And so I think whatever benefits there are for ultra-Orthodox Jews to live in America, financially or any other reason, I think the the great antagonism in which he lives and the fear in which he lives makes up for that. And really, it's my opinion that they all belong in Israel. And hopefully one of these days there will be some huge, airport facilities that will, and some great big jumbo planes that are going to take all of the ultra-Orthodox Jews and hopefully all the religious Jews and hopefully in the end, all the Jews of America to land in Israel where they belong and where they will be safe and respected. And you say, is there room in Israel? Yes, there's room. And I remember the great Russian Aliyah, the thousands of suitcases lined up in Ben Gurion Airport and the buses that came to pick up the new immigrants that came to live in Israel. And here we are, I don't know, 25 years later after that, maybe even more. And, the Russian Jews are Knesset members, and most of the doctors in Israel are Russian Jews. And, I think that anybody who comes to live in Israel is blessed. So that's my answer to that question. And let's see what the last question is. Do women in these communities have the same restrictions? Do they serve in the military? Can they attend universities? Do they work outside the home? This is the next to last question. I would say pretty much the women in both communities are circumscribed by the same strictures. I think that women in America, ultra-Orthodox women in America and in Israel, have to work. There's no one else to support the family. This is a woman's pride that, in the song, Woman of Valor that men sing on Friday night, who is the woman of valor? A price above rubies. She's the woman that runs a business. She buys things, she sells things, she supports her family, because it's always been the case that ever since certainly medieval Jewry, that the men were learning and the women were supporting the family. And because of this, the women were more educated. They had professions. They were, they knew languages, they knew math. And today you have many women who are computer programmers and who work outside the home. I won't say that this doesn't cause some kind of disparity and some kind of conflict in marriages, and you see a lot more divorces today than you ever saw before in the ultra-Orthodox community, and I think that's because of it, because the men are unworldly and the women are out in the world and they're educated, and it's very hard for them to find a partner. So that would be my answer. Do the women serve at the military? No. Religious women can opt out of being drafted into the Israeli army. Some of them choose to go in. Some of them become, instead of army service, they do national service, which is what my daughters did, in which they work in schools and hospitals and other places where they can donate, volunteer their time for the same amount of time they would have been in the army. And right now I have a granddaughter who is in the army, and she is in the Army spokesman's office, and there are girls who are teachers, there are girls who fly planes, some of them from ultra-Orthodox families, but they're not, let's put it this way, welcomed home with open arms if they defy the family and join the army and, learn how to drive a tank. The same is true of the men, but I think the girls, it's much more rare for them to do this. Right now you have situations where there are ultra-Orthodox men who are being drafted and who have their own army units, and I think that they're very useful soldiers, and I think that the number of soldiers coming from the ultra-Orthodox world is growing, but this is not going to happen among the women. And now, last but not least, our last question. Would a convert be accepted into the community with similar prejudices as Leah is in my book? Well, we're talking not only about converts, but in my book we're talking about Jews who are newly religious, who have seen the light and have returned to the fold and become, in this particular case, ultra-Orthodox. And those Jews are called chozrim b'tshuva or ba'alei tshuva, people who have returned to the fold of authentic Judaism. I think that, unfortunately, my answer has to be that I don't see any difference between the American ultra-Orthodox Jewish community and the Israeli ultra-Orthodox Jewish community as far as how the red carpet is put out for people who want to join the Jewish people, either as Jewish returnees to traditional Judaism or actual converts. And I think that this is one of the reasons that I wrote this book, was to bring this problem to the fore and to try to reason with my fellow Jews about how important it is, how many times the Torah tells you, God tells you, that one of the most important mitzvot that a Jew can do is not to oppress the stranger, to welcome him, to not make him feel uncomfortable in any way. And it's a huge sin to remind a convert or a person who's newly Orthodox of their past. And this is something which the Torah condemns, probably more than any other sin. This is condemned. And so I think that this is, unfortunately, something that both communities have to work on. One of the things that you asked me was how I got the idea for this book, and I guess I should expand and just say how I get the idea for any of my books. And a lot of people think that an author chooses a topic and goes after it, but I find in my own particular case that the topic usually chooses me. And that happens. It's almost a mystical experience. You just keep falling over things that are somehow connected, and you read things and you talk to people, and all of a sudden it just congeals into this one big idea that pursues you as a writer relentlessly and insists that you do something with it. And this has happened to me in a number of books, and there are certain books that I can tell you that I did not want to write at all, but the idea chose me. It was the book, especially The Covenant, about terrorism in Israel and terrorist attacks. I did not want to write that book, and the idea just pursued me, and my back was against the wall, and it was shaking its finger in my face saying, "You're going to write this book." So you finally give up and you write it. It wasn't as extreme with An Unorthodox Match, but what happened was, as I started hearing about a woman who was a very famous balat tshuva, someone who was a television personality when she was young, and she was on all kinds of shows, and she lived the high life and the party life in Tel Aviv. And at a certain point, she just somehow found her way back to traditional values and got married, settled down with an equally well-known Israeli personality who was also in the showbiz world, and they settled down, had 7 children, and I heard that they had gotten a divorce and that he was no longer religious. And this idea was so heartbreaking and shocking to me, because I am myself a balat tshuva. I come from a non-observant family, and it was my choice, after my mother sent me for better English and math lessons to an Orthodox Hebrew day school in Far Rockaway, the Hebrew Institute of Long Island, and instead of just getting better English and math, I got a whole new lifestyle and decided to accept Orthodoxy as my own preferred way of living, and became extremely religious and eventually moved to Israel. So I guess in a certain sense, even though it happened when I was very young, you could say that I myself am a balat tshuva, someone who returned to Judaism. And so here I was with this famous story, and I looked into what had happened. And of course, there are many things that probably happened to this family, Noah Yaron Dayan and her husband. But one thing struck me very clearly between the eyes, and that was when she was asked about how she was accepted in the ultra-Orthodox neighborhood in Beit Shemesh, where they went to live. And she said it was torture, and that she felt like she was being run over again and again by the community that refused to accept her children and her husband, and treated them like dirt. So I was heartbroken by this, and it began to think about a story in which I could tell the experience of a Baal Tshuva who comes to live in an ultra-Orthodox community and finds what they find. Also, I'd been talking to a number of young women in their 30s who had come to my lectures, especially in France, where my books are very popular, and they were complaining about how hard it is to find a husband nowadays. And they were all, I think, in their late 20s, early 30s, and I have a son who's in his early 30s, and he's also not married, and I see how he is struggling. And it made me think about the idea of a Baal Tshuva who was in her early 30s, who wanted to find love and marriage and stability and children, and how difficult it was for them to find. And this was another idea that sort of fed into the basic concept. And I think you could say that from this, the story of An Unorthodox Match was born. Some of you have asked me, what is my writing process? Well, it starts with this big idea. I don't do an outline. I only have a little bit of the beginning, sometimes some of the middle, sometimes some of the end, and sometimes nothing at all. And what happens is I begin to write, and the characters talk to me. And they tell me their story, and they tell me what's going to happen in this book. And I cannot veer from this. Even if a character does something which really screws me up plot-wise, and that has happened a number of times, especially I had in Sota, the husband who the wife is not interested in him. And in the real story, he was a pretty boring guy. But in my book, the character turned out to be a wonderful, loving, kind, excellent husband. And that sort of screwed up the plot, and I had to figure out a reason that you wouldn't hate my main character for turning her back on him, and that sort of dictated the plot. And so my process is to listen to my characters, to try to be honest, to not veer from what they're saying. This is called putting your thumb on the scale. If you have a preconceived idea of what you want the book to teach, or you have some kind of moral message you want to give, and you manipulate your characters so that this comes out to be true. I never do that. I have no idea what's going to happen. And the truth of the book comes from the truth of the lives of the characters and what they believe and how they behave and how they communicate this to me. I would say if you want to talk about the writing process, I usually work in the morning because I started working when I had a baby. The first book I wrote, Jeff, his daughter, I had a little baby who got up at 6 o'clock and ate and then went back to sleep till 12 o'clock. And that gave me, my other children were in school at that time. This was my fourth, and it gave me a chance to work. And those few precious hours that I had, and I thank my son, my youngest, Akiva, for sleeping all morning. Unfortunately, he still does that. No, I'm kidding. That's not true. But I like to say it because it's funny. But at that time, when he was a baby, he pretty much allowed me that time to work. And so I find that my most creative time is first thing in the morning, after breakfast, go to my office, sit down, open the computer, and begin to work. How long does it take me to write a book? Well, that depends on how much research I have to do. There are books like The Ghost of Hannah Mendez, when I had to research all Sephardic history. I didn't know anything about Sephardic Jews. I was an Ashkenaziya, from Polish, Russian family, and I didn't know about Sephardic history or Sephardic culture. That took me, and of course the history of the Inquisition, that took me about 5 years before I ever began writing the book. An Unorthodox Match that wasn't the case. I would say that most of the things in this book are things I lived with, things I know very well. I did take a trip to Borough Park and stayed at a good friend's house who lives in Borough Park, and she gave me some invaluable information, and I spoke to people and had people fill out questionnaires about why a 30-something secular woman would want to become Orthodox. And I have these questionnaires, and I thank the people who answered them. Through the internet, I got people to answer these questionnaires, and I used that information. But that didn't take much time. So I would say it took me around a year and a half to 2 years to write this book. And now I'm working on the sequel, An Unorthodox Marriage. And it's the first time I've ever written a sequel, and that's because I really fell in love with these characters. And honestly, I want to know what happens to them.
Well, that was my first try at YouTube. I hope you enjoyed the answers. And please, if you'd like to get more videos, talk me into it. Press the subscribe button below and press the bell so you'll get notifications when I've uploaded a new video. I have lots of things I'd like to talk about, and happy to get suggestions, but I'm really interested in what's going on with anti-Semitism all over the world, and what's happening in Israeli politics, what's happening in the White House interests me as well, and the new peace plan. I'll have lots to say about all of these things, as well as my books. So please come back and join me, and please let me know what you'd like me to talk about. Take care. See you soon.